They say a mother's love is boundless. But what happens when the system fails? When the law seems powerless to protect the innocent? What happens when a grieving mother, drowning in pain, decides to write her own version of justice inside a courtroom in front of the very man who destroyed her life? Before I take you into this haunting story of loss, rage, and ultimate revenge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. These stories aren't just about revenge, they're about justice. About what people are driven to do when their backs are against the wall. Now, let me take you back to the day everything began to unravel. My name is Marianne, and if you hear my story today, you might think you'd never walk the same path I did. You might say, I could never do what she did, but grief changes you. Losing a child the way I lost mine, it turns you into something you don't recognize. Anna was my little girl, 7 years old, bright as the morning sun, stubborn like me, and full of laughter that filled every corner of our small house in Lubeck. She was curious, strong-willed, and sometimes too fearless for her own good. That morning, May 5th, 1980, we argued. Just a simple mother-daughter squabble. She wanted to bring her stuffed rabbit to school. I said no, it was dirty. It needed washing. She pouted, crossed her arms, and stomped her tiny foot like she always did when she thought she was right. I thought nothing of it. Arguments like these come and go. But when she slammed the door and muttered, "I'm not going to school today," I laughed. "Don't be silly, Anna. Of course you're going." Only she didn't doubt by the time I realized she hadn't gone to school. It was too late. The hours passed in a blur of panic. At first, I told myself maybe she was with a friend, maybe she'd gone exploring. But as night fell and no trace of Anna appeared, my stomach twisted into a pit of fear I can't describe. Every mother has that primal instinct, the moment you just know. Something terrible had happened. When the police came, they tried to reassure me. Runaways happen. She's only 7, but children wander. Their words were meant to calm me. But every syllable felt like sandpaper on my skin. And then came the name, Klaus Grabowski. I knew of him. Everyone in town did. A man with a shadowed past. A 35-year-old butcher, quiet on the surface, but whispers followed him everywhere. He had cats that lured children in like some grotesque fairy tale. And Anna, my Anna, had visited his home before, just to pet them. That night, he kept her. That night, he did things to her that no child should endure. That night, he stole my daughter from me, the details. Even now, I can barely bring myself to say them aloud. The prosecutor later revealed how he held her for hours, how he touched her, how he strangled her with his fiancé's tights. My little girl, her last moments filled with confusion, fear, and betrayal. And then, like she was garbage, he stuffed her into a box and dumped her by the canal. I screamed until my throat bled when they told me. I tore at my clothes, my hair. There are no words for that kind of loss. There's only emptiness. When the police brought him in, I wanted to see his face. I wanted to see what kind of monster could destroy something so pure. But when I finally laid eyes on him, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man, ordinary, forgettable. That was the horror of it, evil. Hiding behind such banality, they told me he'd been in prison before, that he had a history of abusing children, that he'd volunteered for chemical castration, then took hormones to reverse it, that his fiancée threatened to leave him if he ever harmed another child. And so, terrified of losing her, he killed mine. Do you understand the weight of that? My daughter wasn't just murdered. She was collateral in his pathetic battle to keep a woman. I thought justice would come. I thought the courts would bring me peace. But as the trial dragged on, as I sat there day after day hearing his lawyers twist the story, watching him sit there, smug, calm, unrepentant, something inside me began to break. The system wasn't built for mothers like me. It wasn't built for victims. It was built for men like him, and as I sat in that courtroom, staring at the back of his head, one thought grew louder and louder in my mind. What if justice doesn't come? What if I have to deliver it myself? I didn't know it yet, but that thought would become my obsession. Night after night, as I stared at my daughter's empty bed, I whispered the same question. If the law won't protect Anna, what kind of mother am I if I don't? The days after Anna's funeral blurred into one another. Mornings felt like a cruel joke. The sun still rose, people still hurried to work, children still laughed in schoolyards. The world carried on, while mine had collapsed into rubble. I couldn't walk past her room without my knees giving out. Her toys sat where she left them, her little shoes still by the door. I couldn't move them. To move them felt like letting her go, and I wasn't ready. Not then, maybe never. Sleep? Impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her tiny hands reaching out for me, heard her voice calling Mana in the dark. Some nights, I swore I heard her footsteps padding down the hallway. And when silence fell, the images came his hands around her neck. The fear in her eyes, the trial began, and I thought being there, facing him, would give me strength. But sitting in that courtroom was its own form of torture. The smell of stale wood and paper, the echo of footsteps, the low murmurs of journalists who scribbling notes, it was suffocating. And then there was him. Klaus Grabowski sat just meters away, calm, almost bored. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the gallery, but he never really looked at me. To him, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't even a person. I was just an obstacle in the way of his performance. His lawyers painted him as a man with illness, a man tormented by his condition. They spoke of his fancy's influence, of his fragile mental state. Not once did they say Anna's name with the reverence it deserved. She was reduced to the child. The child. Do you know how it feels to hear your baby's life summarized like that? To have her existence boiled down to a footnote in someone else's tragedy. The rage boiled inside me, but I had no outlet. I clenched my fists until my nails cut into my palms. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, just to stop myself from screaming across the room. After one particularly brutal day in court, I went home and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were hollow, ringed with black. My cheeks gaunt. I barely recognized the woman staring back. I pressed my palms to the sink and whispered to myself, I can't live like this. I can't just watch. I tried to lean on friends, but they didn't understand. They hugged me, brought food, told me to be strong. But strength? Strength had abandoned me. What I had left was something far darker. At night, I walked the streets alone, letting the cold bite at my skin. My mind spiraled with what-ifs. What if I'd insisted she go to school? What if I'd walked her myself? What if I'd stopped her from ever stepping foot near his house? Guilt weighed on me heavier than grief, and then came the press. Cameras flashed every morning outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions I refused to answer. They wanted drama, spectacle. They wanted to turn Anna's tragedy into a headline that sold papers. I hated them for it, but part of me also knew they were feeding something. They were feeding the attention he craved. One afternoon, I overheard two journalists whispering in the corridor. He's not even sorry, one muttered. Says he regrets being caught more than anything. My heart stopped. My ears rang. Not sorry. Not for Anna, not for me. Just sorry for himself. That night, lying in bed, the thought returned. Louder this time, clearer. If the law won't punish him, I will. The idea terrified me. Me, an ordinary woman, a mother, someone who'd never even held a weapon in her life. But grief makes the unimaginable possible. I began to imagine it in detail. The sound of a gun cocking, the look on his face when he realized, the silence that would follow, and every time I imagined it, The knot in my chest loosened just a little, but then came the doubts. Could I really do it? Could I walk into that courtroom with death in my purse? Could I pull the trigger in front of strangers, police, and cameras? For days, I wrestled with it. The war between rage and fear raged inside me. But fear never won for long, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Anna, her smile, her stubborn little stomp, her laughter echoing down the hallway, and then her silence. That silence became unbearable. And I knew something had to break. The question was no longer if I'd take revenge, but when. And once that line is crossed in your heart, there's no turning back. I still remember the moment the decision hardened inside me, not like the flicker of an idea, but like ice forming in my bones. It didn't come with drums or lightning, just a quiet, terrible clarity. If I didn't act, Anna's death would be another name in a file, another paragraph in a transcript, another photograph in an archive that people thumbed through and forgot. I could not allow that. I would not let her become a footnote. People imagine planning as a mechanical thing, lists, blueprints, rehearsals. For me, it began in a different place, the belly of grief. Every night I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. The old clock in the hallway counted off seconds in thin, indifferent ticks. The radio whispered news that was never about Anna. Each tick felt like the world moving on without justice. Each tick was a demand. "Tell me what you're thinking," my neighbor Elsa said once, sitting tentatively on my kitchen chair, her hands folded like a child's. I clutched a mug of tea until it went cold and I didn't answer. How do you tell someone that the only thing keeping you from collapsing into a crater of rage is the image of a man's face with a red sunburst over it? How do you tell someone that you imagine him finally seeing what he had done reflected back at him, and that the reflection is not just a courtroom verdict, but the finality of a gunshot? You learn to mask the growl in your voice. You learn to let people think you'll be okay, because their pity is easier to carry than their questions. I began to say things like, I just want the trial to end. I started attending with a calm I did not feel. I practiced how to sit in the public benches, how to fold my hands, how to let my face be a neutral mask. It was theater, a role I would play until the curtain lifted. The turning point was not one thunderous scene. It was a corridor conversation that should have been unremarkable. A prosecutor, weary from paperwork, passed me with a list of papers in his hand. "Mrs. Bachmeier," he said, glancing at my face that had once been soft and warm and now seemed serrated. He spoke in that measured legal cadence. "We're doing everything we can. Please understand the process takes time." I looked at him and time felt like an insult. "I don't need time," I said. "I need justice." He gave me that look, the one that people give to people who are making emotional choices. He patted my shoulder like a favor. In that touch I felt small, like a child being consoled. A hot wave of humiliation burned me. The thought rose, a dangerous, lucid thing. If the system would soothe and defer and soothe again, if their everything meant nothing but waiting, then I would have to take the rhythm of justice into my own hands. From then on, there was an unfamiliar sort of discipline. Not the frantic, chaotic energy that follows tragedy, but a cold, organized steadiness. It was survival. It was ritual. I kept a journal, not of plans, but of sensations, the way a surgeon logs a body. I wrote down how my hands shook when I held the pen, the taste of copper at the back of my throat when I thought of him, the way the courthouse smelled of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. I wrote the times I had been to court and the times I had sat in my kitchen and listened to the silence. People ask what I felt in those hours. The best word I can find is hunger. A hunger that was not for food, but for an end. I would wake with my teeth clenched, walk listlessly to the window and watch the street vendors set up their stands. Life going on. The grief sat in my chest like a stone, and the hunger clawed its way around it. When you are starving, you do not think about method. You think about satiation. That was the narrowness of my mind in those months. So planning, for me, was as much about mental preparation as anything concrete. I replayed scenes, not how to get a gun or how to hide it or how to get through security, but the emotional choreography. I imagined walking into the room, the way the light would fall on the polished wood, the hush that always precedes testimony. I pictured his face and the way his mouth would tighten if someone finally called him monster to his face. I imagined his fiancée's expression, the betrayal carved there, and the reporters scribbling furiously as if they'd been handed the final, sickening paragraph of a novel. I practiced the cadence of my own voice. Not to sound angry all the time, that would be predictable, but to surprise him with conviction. I knew I wanted him to look at me, to truly see me. People who do harm to children hide behind ordinary faces, and the ordinary is what lets them move freely in the world. My plan, in the most essential way, was to pierce that ordinariness with something irrevocable, but I also rehearsed fear. I rehearsed the tremor in my hands, the racing of my heart. I stood before a mirror and let the image of despair wash over me until it felt familiar, until the trembling became a tool. I rehearsed the things I would say if I were stopped, the lies I would tell if asked why I was nervous. I prepared myself to face the security guard's glare and the judge's rebuke. I envisioned the moment of action as if it were a line of dialogue in a play. Short, devastating, necessary. There were close calls that tightened my chest into knots. Once, after a particularly fraught court session, I stood in the corridor and overheard two jurors whispering. "She seems unstable," one said. She could do anything. The word unstable was meant to infantilize me. Instead, it was a recognition. If I were unstable, it was because of what had been done to me and to Anna. For weeks I was sure someone was watching me, eyes on the bus, a man with a newspaper glancing over his shoulder. The paranoia was a cloak I wore and couldn't take off. After one trial day, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and stared at my hands on the steering wheel. My knuckles were white. I had to remind myself that action would not erase the wound. It would not bring Anna back, but the idea of confronting him before the world, of making the world look at him for what he was, offered a kind of terrifying solace. My neighbors began to notice the changes. Elsa would drop off a plate of food, and the conversation would circle like frightened birds. "You should move away," she would say. New start. Moving felt like betrayal. To leave the place where Anna had laughed, where she had left her little socks by the door, would be to hand those spaces over to him. The memory must live where the memory happened, I thought, stubborn and irrational. The courthouse, the canal, the house that now had a yellow ribbon where Anna's friends had tied it, these were the bones of my life, and I could not flee them. The more time I spent in that environment, the more I learned the rhythms of the legal theater. I watched how the judge leaned forward, how he listened to the prosecution and then to the defense. I watched how minutes turned to hours, how witnesses were harmed by cross-examination designed to humiliate, how the press loved spectacle but never the sorrow behind it. I made mental notes. The judge tended to call for afternoon recesses at certain times. The camera that usually focused on the defendant was often on the far left. Reporters liked to stand near the main entrance, and the police officers stationed near the benches tended to be complacent, counting on routine. Stop me if you're looking for specifics on weapons or concealment, because I won't give them to you. This story is not a how-to. I refuse to offer a manual for anyone else who might hear the ache I felt and interpret it as permission. What I will tell you is the interior blueprint, how my mind narrowed, how my body learned to carry the weight of the irreversible decision. The true planning was about holding the moment of consequence steady in my chest until the tremor in it became a kind of courage. There were nights I sat with other mothers at the church, in that small room with the stained glass light, and we shared stories. Their faces were maps of grief. Some said the courtroom would be enough. Others said there were things worse than loss, like being ignored. One woman, her hands wrapped around a candle stub, said softly, "Sometimes the law is blind." We all nodded like that contained wisdom. And in the quiet, I felt my resolve congeal. Then there was the practical cruelty of life trying to be normal. My phone would ring. My sister would ask about groceries. The landlord would come for rent. The world's mundane demands were battering rams against the raw interior grief. I learned how to mask my intent under such ordinariness. I paid my bills. I washed my clothes. I visited the canal, sometimes at dawn alone, shivering in the early air. At the canal, I would stand and stare at the water they had found her near and imagine the ripples carrying the fragment of a life away. It was obscene how indifferent the water could seem. It moved. It reflected sky. It did not cry. The hardest part was the isolation that planning creates. You become secretive not only to hide the plot, but because you are trying to protect others from your choice. I thought of the pain my family would feel if they knew what I planned, and I kept them at a distance. I cut off certain friends who asked probing questions. Sometimes I called my sister and made small talk about weather, and afterward I would shake with exhaustion, chafed by the lie. There were people who tried to show me another path. A counselor at the Victim Support Center, a gentle woman with gray hair, offered me alternatives: counseling, civic action, petitions for stricter sentencing, letters to the editor. She sat across from me and said the words slow and careful, as if they were precious crystals. There are ways to channel your anger that don't put you at risk. Her voice was warm, thin as hope. I listened because she was kind and true, and then I listened harder to the small voice in my chest that asked whether her kindness could stop the man who had killed my child from sitting smugly in a courtroom. Once, in a moment of brittle clarity, I wrote a letter to Anna that I never sent. I sat at the small table by the kitchen window and poured out the brokenness with a pen that scratched like a shard. I told her the small things I had refused to say at the funeral, how her hair smelled like soap, how she used to hide peas under her plate and then giggle when I pretended not to know, how her stubbornness made me proud. I ended the letter with a promise that felt both terrible and necessary. I would not let her die in silence, and in making that promise, I made another, to myself. I would not allow my memory of her to be diminished by legalese and pity. I would ensure that the world would look at Klaus for what he was. Whether the world then chose to punish him for what I did, or to call me a monster, I did not know. But I did know that I could not live knowing I had done nothing. Night before the day I decided I would make my move, the day that the prosecution was expected to present a crucial witness. Sleep left me like a retreating tide. I sat in the dark kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum. I thought of Anna's laugh, the way she used to pat my cheek like she was tucking me in. The house felt enormous and empty. I placed a pair of her shoes on the table and held them until my fingers went numb. Memories rose like a tide, a smell of sugar, her small voice mispronouncing words. The time she tried to cut her hair with an old pair of kitchen scissors, and we both laughed until we cried, and then the panic. What would happen afterward? Would the act bring peace or a heavier kind of torment? I imagined headlines, courtroom footage, the judge's expression, the gavel pounding down. I imagined my name pronounced like a sentence in the mouths of strangers. I thought of Anna's grave, the small stone with her name, and whether I would be allowed to visit it if I was taken away. These were practical worries, human concerns, and even now, I cannot pretend they did not factor dot in the early morning. When the sky was a thin pearly color and the city still smelled of rain on stone, I packed a small bag. Not because I wanted to flee, but because I wanted to be ready. I packed a clean blouse, a handkerchief with my initials, and a small photograph of Anna, the one where she wore a knitted hat and squinted into the sun. I held it against my heart. It did not make the decision easier, but it made it real. When I walked to the courthouse that day. There was a calm that surprised me. The air was crisp. The sunlight fell in through the tall court windows and landed in rectangles on the polished floor. People were moving about, their shoes tapping in random rhythms like some cruel metronome. Reporters were already there, their cameras slung and microphones ready. He was there too, farther down the bench, his hands folded like a man at ease before a small private breakfast. I sat in the gallery with my knees pressed together. Each breath felt measured, a practiced sound. The courtroom felt like a living thing, heavy with the coffee smell of people, the faint dust motes turning in the shafts of light, the hush that descends when a judge enters. The prosecution rose. The witness took the stand. I sat very still, as if stillness itself could be a shield. My heart beat, a steady drum in my ribs. Every narrative I had built in my head, the speeches, the looks, the gasps from the gallery, converged into one crystalline path. I rehearsed the lines I would use not as a litany of violence, but as an unveiling. I wanted the naked truth to be seen. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done in a way that no verdict could express. Yet, even in that steel-clad clarity, doubt slipped in. For a sliver of a moment, the old fears returned. What if I failed? What if I faltered and in the fumbling caused more harm? What if the shot missed and a bystander was hurt? The images of Anna being harmed were a monstrous thing to bear. The idea of another child being hurt because of me was an unbearable counterfactual. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, and inside that darkness, I heard nothing but the hollow sound of the clock's tick. Then, like a small, stubborn seed, a result sprouted. I thought of all the small indignities, the way his lawyers had smiled, the way his eyes had never met mine, the way the papers called him the accused, as if that softened him. I thought of my daughter's hands and the way they had twined around my finger when she had first learned to hold on. That image gave me a strange kind of calm. The witness on the stand finished, and the judge called for a recess. The room slowly emptied, and I felt the air change, like a lung expanding. People moved in clusters, gossiping, brushing shoulders. I stood up. My legs felt like spindles. I folded my coat over my arm, a motion so ordinary it might have betrayed nothing. As I stepped toward the aisle, a reporter named Klaus, not him, a different name, brushed past me. He smiled, oblivious, and said, "Mrs. Bachmeier, any comment?" I opened my mouth and closed it. Words would make the moment smaller. I moved like someone on a wire, careful, until the bench where he sat was within view. He looked up briefly and our eyes met. For the first time in months, his face registered surprise. He looked unsettled. That tiny fissure in his composure felt like a triumph, and then the guards began to stand in positions that people who had been there long knew meant nothing. They were visible, polite. The world hummed as if a storm were waiting at the edge of sight. My breath hitched. Time compressed. I felt the photograph of Anna warm against my chest. In that instant, everything was distilled into a single, unavoidable truth. I could still turn away. I could melt into the crowd and let the system run its course. The cold room would return to its usual noises and the trial would progress. Or I could do what I had rehearsed in the lonely hours and make the world witness. The end of the story as I needed it to be witnessed. I walked forward, and then, as the courtroom door closed behind the judge, the hush fell into a sound like a held breath. The final piece of the plan, the moment of execution, was a line ahead. I had practiced the posture, the movement, the sound in my head until it was precise. I felt the weight of what it would do to me and to the world, and then I stepped over the threshold. The room exhaled. Everyone's gaze was a single, attentive thing, a tide that turned toward me. I raised my head, and in that exact heartbeat before everything happened, somebody in the audience coughed, a small human sound that fractured the moment, a reminder that the world was full of small noises, and the terrible thing I was about to do was about to be committed in a chorus of them. I stood there, the world narrowing to a pinprick. I felt my heart banging like something trying to escape. I could still stop, but the image of Anna, small, stubborn, irreducible, filled my vision. My hand moved. The moment my hand moved, everything else narrowed to a single, terrible note. There's a sound I'll never forget, the raw, cracked sound of something impossible happening. It was not a cinematic boom. It was a shattering like glass breaking slow and purposeful. It ricocheted off the wood-paneled walls and the chandeliers and the rows of eyes, until it returned to the center of the room where I stood. For an instant, the world felt like the inside of a bell, clear, ringing, everything vibrating with the same frequency. People screamed. Not a single, unified scream, but a dozen sharp, different sounds, women's high cries, men's shocked curses, the scuff of feet on polished floors. Papers flew. A camera's flash blinked, and then the room smelled of metal and fear. An acrid electric tang that clung to the air like smoke. I remember the heat at my fingers as if the act had left a burn that traveled up my arm into my chest. The thing I had been carrying was no longer a plan, but an event, and events have aftershocks. Klaus fell. I saw the motion in a slow, impossible film. His head lolled, then rested where it had been perfectly ordinary an instant before. His face went from the insouciant complacency I had watched for months to a look of absolute, startled incomprehension. Up close, he looked smaller. Ordinary turned brittle. The viewers' mouths formed shapes that weren't words. For a breath, he was still human in a way that made me want to vomit thin, soundless gasps and eyes that could not quite reconcile what was happening. I heard someone shout, "Call the police." Though police were already in the room, their uniforms a panicked blur. Hands grabbed me firm, urgent, not gentle. I remember the sensation of being pulled back, the helpless little buoy of my body bobbing in a tidal wave of other people's reactions. Journalists threw down their notebooks and reached for phones. Someone shoved a coat under his head. Someone else shouted at a guard to keep the crowd back. I felt the hot flash of camera lights like a constellation burning just for me. My knees buckled and I sat on the bench, hardly conscious of the fall. The sound that kept repeating over and over in my head was not the gunshot, but the echo of Anna calling me in the dark. And under that, the hollow taste of finality and ending that would never undo the beginning. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel cleansed. There was a second after the noise where the rush that had sustained me collapsed like scaffolding. Beneath the act was the raw, aching place that had always been there, my daughter's absence. For a moment, I thought I might faint right there in the courtroom, swallowed by the enormity of the thing I had done. Hands firm and authoritative pulled me to my feet. A woman's face, the judge's clerk, was streaked with tears. "Why?" she asked. The question was both small and enormous, the one that would hang in the air for months. I had no words that felt adequate. I had rehearsed a speech in the quiet hours 1,000 times about justice, about a mother's grief, but in that tangle of reactions, the rehearsed phrases seemed brittle and cheap. All I could think of was Anna's face. They took me away. Not with malice, but with the mechanical rigor of a system that had its own momentum even in chaos. The courtroom emptied into a flurry of police statements, notes, and the low, frantic speech of reporters. Someone told me later that the cameraman had kept filming until the guards actually pushed me out, and that a full minute of stunned silence had been broadcast to networks that night. I remember none of that clearly, only the feel of cuffs tightening, the whisper of cloth as I was led through corridors lined with people staring. Days that followed were a war of documentation. Statements were taken. Witnesses were interviewed. The press turned an act into an hour-by-hour spectacle, and the world that had once been private and raw was suddenly public and dissected. Headlines screamed. People took sides. Some called me a murderer. Some called me a hero. Both words were blunt instruments that refused to carry the complexity of what had happened. When I was arraigned, the courtrooms felt like different rooms, smaller, more clinical. The man I had ended lay in a place I couldn't bear to see with my own eyes. Photographs were circulated. He was a man again, and the photographs made him ordinary and mortal in ways that did not unmake what he had done. The law took its course with a patience that felt like insult. They read the charges. They read my name like a sentence. I did not attempt to deny what I had done. Denial would have been a lie, and I could not lie to myself. In those moments, the truth felt like a shard, clear, unambiguous, and both freeing and damning. I told them that I had come for justice because no other justice had seemed forthcoming. I spoke about Anna. I said her name as if the repetition might conjure her back. The judge listened with the expression of someone cataloging a matter that would be argued. Analyzed and decided, the defense and the prosecution began their celestial dance. Motive and madness were thrown across tables with legal precision. Psychiatric evaluations followed. I was examined, interrogated, as if my soul could be placed under a microscope. The Crown painted a picture of premeditation and cold calculation. The defense painted a portrait of a woman broken by grief, whose mind had been pushed beyond survival. Both were true in ways that were impossible to reconcile. Public reaction split the town in two and then in many more pieces. Petitions circulated, some in my favor, some condemning me outright. Strangers wrote me letters. Some called me a monster, some a mother who had finally done what the law would not. In cafes, people debated whether a mother had the right to take such action, whether the legal system had failed to protect its most vulnerable. The world loves a simple verdict. Human emotions are rarely simple, but there it was on every doorstep, on every headline, a question mark that cannot be smoothed away. When the trial finally reached sentencing, the judge's words sounded distant and layered like someone reading from behind a door. He spoke of the sanctity of law, of deterrent principles, and of the necessity of punishment for taking a life. The sentence was a weight for manslaughter and unlawful possession, a prison term that would be measured in years, not in the small, intimate measures of time that hold a family together. I was given 6 years. I would serve 3 before being released on probation. The sentence draped over me like a cloak. It was too short for what some wanted and too heavy for what others hoped taught prison was a place of grinding routine. The cell walls were gray and narrow, and the world outside seemed ridiculous and distant. At night, the cries of other women, some for crimes of desperation, some for crimes of passion, echoed down the hall like a chorus. I kept Anna's photograph folded in my palm. It was a small secret thing I smuggled into the grayness, a sunlit face, a knitted hat, a stubborn squint. There, in the privacy of a bunk, I read her face like scripture. Time in prison did not undo what I had done. It did not bring back the laughter that had once filled our kitchen, but it did force me into a close, relentless confrontation with myself. People visited, some came with anger that could not be softened even by another's obvious grief. Others came with compassion so wide it baffled me. There were women who told me their stories in murmurs, daughters lost, husbands taken, lives ruptured by an indifferent world. In the quiet hours, we traded scraps of solace like currency. The public debate about my actions did not end with my arrest. It changed shape and tone over the year's papers. Op-eds, late-night discussions, condemnations from politicians who feared to take a side. Some argued that my act exposed the failings of the justice system. Others used it as a cudgel to argue for harsher punishment for vigilante crimes. The law, of course, had to hold. If every grieving parent had the right to mete out final justice, civil order would devolve into chaos. That argument is straightforward and chilling. But there was another argument quieter. What happens to the survivors of the most intimate crimes when the structures meant to respond bend, stall, and sometimes fail? I served my time. I was released early for good behavior, which is a small mercy in a world of arbitrary mercies. The world outside had not stopped debating me, but it had resumed its charts and markets and quiet mornings. I moved abroad for a while, partly to escape the constant glare and partly because the weight of staying in the same streets where my child had once lived was unbearable. The landscape became a blur of places. I walked through like someone testing the skins of new lives. Every so often, reporters found me. They wanted statements. They wanted to know if I regretted what I had done. Regret is complicated. I regret the way my daughter died, the thing that set everything in motion. I regret that my act of retribution could not bring her back. I regret the human cost that trickled outward, the people who called me criminal, the ones who had to watch a life ended in such a small space. But mixed with that was a dull private satisfaction, the knowledge, however temporary, that a man who had taken a life could not spend the rest of his days comfortable and unremarked. That is not the same as peace. It is not a balm. But it was something, years later, when my body began to betray me with pains that did not leave. When doctors spoke words like pancreatic and prognosis, I felt myself folding inward in a different way. I thought often of Anna's grave. I thought of how she would prefer tulips in spring to stiff, formal wreaths. I returned to Germany and walked to the small cemetery in Lübeck where she lay. The stone with her name was small, and my fingers traced it as if reading Braille. People sometimes asked me if I had felt vindicated by the act that had made me famous and infamous in equal measure. Vindication is a bright, brittle thing. It's not useful for warming a cold night. The grave was simple. It was quiet. That was enough. I do not want to be mythologized. People make monsters out of grief sometimes, and they make saints out of desperation. I was neither. I was a woman who had been pushed by unthinkable pain to an action that would ripple outward longer than I could have predicted. I have been called a mother, a murderer, an avenger, a symbol. None of those labels fit neatly. The truth is messy, a tangle of suffering and choice. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not a single, tidy moral. The clearest thing I can say is this: systems fail, people fail. And sometimes the only ones who feel the full weight of the failure are those whose love was most tender. When the law hesitates, when official mechanisms falter in the face of human cruelty, those left in the wake are forced to make impossible decisions in a world with no good options. In the end, I went back to that pale photograph of Anna again and again. I held her face to the light and tried to breathe in the days we had. I told her of small things, how the trees had turned in the city, how strangers still wrote letters, how the world continued to argue about me long after I stopped arguing. I placed flowers on her grave and sometimes whispered the things I never got to say. Justice, as the law defines it, was not the same as the justice I exacted. The law restored order. My act altered the moral ledger in a way no court could fully account for. I paid a price. I also made sure the man who took my daughter could no longer hide. Whether that was right or wrong is for others to weigh, but ask yourself this: When a system is supposed to protect the innocent and fails, what is left for those who have lost everything? I died at 46. The cancer was swift and indifferent. At my funeral, people argued on websites and talk shows and over coffee about whether I had been brave or deranged. None of their words warmed me. What warmed me finally was the quiet of a life measured not in headlines, but in small mornings and the memory of a laugh. If you listen to this story and the part of you that says, I could never know this, grief mutates people in ways they cannot imagine. It narrows the world to what is intolerable and pushes towards the impossible. And if you feel anger when you hear about the failures of justice, remember that anger is a signpost. It points somewhere. The question is not whether anger exists, but what you let it make you do. I do not ask for your absolution. I do not plead that you must call me hero or villain. I only ask that when you think of my story, you think of the small human things that started it, a child's stubbornness about a stuffed rabbit, a mother's routine irritation, a world that moved on while a life ended. The rest is the human cost of failing to protect the small and the innocent. In the end, the truest justice is the one that makes us examine how we care for each other before tragedy writes its own. Laws. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. There are more real stories of grief, justice, and impossible choices in the channel. Tell me what you think in the comments. Was she a monster, a mother, or something in between? Share respectfully, this one lived and hurt. If you want another deep dive into a real-life case like this, tell me which one and I'll find it. Thank you for listening.